5G is rated as a high impact emerging risk by authorities in the insurance industry. And this is incredibly important because if insurance companies are not willing to take the risk, then the question becomes, why should we? So that is a report from Swiss Re that just came out. There's also several reports by insurance companies, and we have those on the Environmental Health Trust webpage at ehtrust.org under Insurance White Papers, where we list the different reports over the last few years, actually going back decades, that classify electromagnetic radiation, non-ionizing, microwaves, cell phone radiation, wireless radiation, as a high risk. And several of those reports compare the impact to asbestos. I talked about some of this in my webinar from the other day, because there is international opposition to the 5G rollout. And today I'm going to highlight some other really important work that's going on in other countries. But in the United States, there are several city councils that are passing ordinances to retain their authority as much as possible in terms of the rollout of 5G small cells. And I would highlight, we do have this on our website as well, under city ordinances related to 5G. Los Altos have banned small cells in residential areas. There's a 500-foot setback from schools. In Italy, and actually I need to update this because I'm going to talk about it today, there are 67 municipalities who have passed resolutions to halt 5G. So I better update that slide. I apologize about that. In Switzerland, there's several municipal areas which have passed resolutions to halt the small cell rollout until safety has been shown. And there's a national conversation happening there in Switzerland. And we have all of that on our other webinar as well. And the United Kingdom, I think we have now 5 municipalities, I'm going to talk about that a little bit, that have passed resolutions to halt 5G. Ireland, 5 city councils, and oops, I realized I should make this large so that you can see everything. Okay. So one of the issues related to, probably one of the most important issues, has to do with the FCC, or in other countries, ICNIR, in terms of what are the legal limits? Are there safety limits? Why is 5G and the 4G densification being allowed to roll out when there are so many scientists stating that this radiation is harmful, and that the levels that have been set by authorities are non-protective? What is going on? So I'll talk a little bit about what's happening in the United States, where we have the Federal Communications Commission, and our limits were adopted in 1996. They've been unchanged since then for the most part. When this happened, the Environmental Protection Agency, that usually would have authority in these matters, was defunded in an appropriations bill. The Telecommunications Act was passed. The FCC got authority and took on limits which were created by industry-filled groups. These limits are based on the assumption, which has been now disproven, which I'm going to talk about, that heating is the only harm that can come from wireless radiation, radio frequency, microwave radiation. So wireless is radio frequency radiation, also used in microwave ovens. Frequency is also used in microwave ovens. And obviously at a high power, it is going to heat, just like microwaves heat food. So our limits are based on the assumption that the only way that this radiation can be harmful is by the heating effect. It also Like our cell phone pre-market safety tests we do are based on a phantom of a 220-pound male, not children, not pregnant women, not babies. And they didn't even look at data that investigated the impacts to children from this type of radiation. At that time, when the limits were set, they actually used limits created by industry groups, which had looked at research studies on small animals and small mammals, short-term studies, high levels of exposure for a short time. They didn't look at what would be the impact over years, over living beings that are chronically exposed. So in the United States, our U.S. Department of the Interior actually wrote a letter actually it was 2012, stating that the electromagnetic radiation standards used by the FCC are based on thermal heating, a criterion nearly 30 years out of date and absolutely inapplicable today. And that, of course, remains true. What is really interesting is that in the United States, the FCC is saying that our limits do not need to be changed, despite the ever-mounting mountain of evidence showing harm. And I, along with several experts in the field, including Frank Clegg, former Microsoft Canada president, Margaret Sears of Prevent Cancer in Canada, and several other experts, Cindy Russell of Physicians for Safe Technology, published a paper in Building in the Environment, where we not only talk about, well, the main point was summarizing the research, talking about how to reduce levels of radio frequency in buildings, but there's also a section on 5G, talking about all the recent actions to halt the rollout. At this point, because so much has happened over the last few months, this is actually now outdated because there have been so many new actions, but it still remains a super important paper which details how to reduce exposure in buildings by using wired, not wireless networks in the building. And by doing that, you can have super fast internet service, internet connections, and phone connections, but without the radio frequency exposure from those networks. And something that is pointed out in this paper, which is also very important, is that in the United States, along with Australia and actually several other countries, we use limits for the maximum permissible levels allowed, like in the air around us, much higher than other countries which have more strict precautionary limits, such as Israel, China, Turkey, Bulgaria, Poland, Italy. And in those countries, industry is saying that in order to fully deploy 5G, they need to increase the allowable limits, to allow more, to loosen the regulations, to allow more radiation because of the intensities which will be around the antennas. And of course, if you have quite literally millions of new antenna sites around the world, and in a local community, we have a community where we have, in Montgomery County, literally over 200 applications for new small cell sites. And that's going to intensify the overall levels in the vicinity of the antenna, of course. So industry is saying that they have to loosen those limits. A lot is going on, like in Poland, for example, where they're talking about changing the limits, as well as in Italy and several other countries. So in the United Kingdom, there are now, so I guess we have Brighton, Hove, and pardon me if I misspeak on how to pronounce these cities: Devonshire, Shepton Mallet, which is in Somerset, and Frome, Totnes, Glastonbury, and Trafford, that have all issued resolutions to halt the 5G rollout. And I'll just read a quote from one of the resolutions. Frome Town Council has a moral responsibility to protect public health and the local environment. until there is more scientific consensus that 5G wireless radiation is harmless to humans and the environment, the FTC, the Council, adopts the precautionary principle and will not endorse the rollout of 5G.
I do worry also about the impact of social media on mental health and the increasing addictive nature of smartphones, which is impacting on the lives of the youngest of children. There is some evidence for effects of radio frequency signals on mental health and behaviour in children and young people. Yet they are not currently considered when trying to address the current increase in mental health and behavioural problems in the UK. Minister, can we include the effects of wireless signals when considering solutions for mental health and behavioural problems in children and young people? The recent advice from the UK Chief Medical Officers on screen time and well-being in young people has ignored evidence for the adverse effects of wireless signals. I will on that point.
Can I just ask you a question about the wider environmental impact? Because she'll know that 4G is the carbon footprint of all of aviation. 5G is going to be a lot more. And what's more, we're now hearing that 5G will have a detrimental impact on insect life, which globally is decreasing at 2.5% a year. And given the insects are required to pollinate all fruits and vegetables and therefore essential to humanity, doesn't she think that we should apply the precautionary principle here so we know precisely what the impact will be both on insects and on carbon footprint before hurtling ahead for commercial reasons?
I thank my honourable friend for his contribution, and I think that climate change and the insect life is something that we need to take into consideration as well when we are discussing the impact of electrosensitivity, electromagnetic fields. As MPs, we have a duty of care to our constituents. There's no escaping the fact that when questions are posed about the safety of new technologies by MPs, schools, local authorities and others, they are given a standard reply from governments. People who question about the health-related effects of electromagnetic fields are just coming up against a brick wall, and I want to break through that wall and pose a number of questions to the Minister today. I like to think that taking safety into account when developing projects and considering safety and sustainability really is the smart way to move forward into the future. Yes, I will.
Remember the Trade and Industry Select Committee many years ago, we investigated this, and with all sorts of experts, but nobody could come to a conclusion about it. That's not to say my honourable friend is wrong, that's just to say it was looked at about 20 years ago. But the question I was going to ask her, is there any evidence that that can affect the behaviour of animals, for example? Not only human beings, but animals. Is there?
So, as I said, it would be useful if the government were to put on record some of the studies and their responses to that studies. And as my honourable friend has just said, one of the real problems is, now we're into 5G, there's a view that where there are already masts, you can just add to. Where there are no masts, you can already put additional technology on them. And I asked the Minister, the biggest worry is that there's a view, certainly in Stroud, that lampposts will be a perfectly acceptable means by which these masts can be substituted by not having to put new ones up. You can just put them on to existing infrastructure. So it would be useful to know from the Minister what powers there are, because I understand in terms of the Electronic Communications Code powers, it's virtually granted unlimited power to the companies to either construct or maintain or develop the current infrastructure without any planning permission. It's all done under delegated responsibility, which means that the general public don't even know what's going on.
So this is happening worldwide, where people in their communities are going to their elected officials and asking for action on this issue.
We know currently that the wireless technology is classified as possibly carcinogenic according to the World Health Organization on the 31st of May 2011. And since then there have been tens of thousands of studies to indicate that the exposure to radio frequencies can cause serious adverse health effects.
Here is a picture from a group in Italy. In Italy again. And as I mentioned, I just found out that there are 67 municipalities opposed to 5G in Italy. And this is just a screen save here from the Italian Alliance for Stop 5G that is tracking all of this. There are presentations happening countrywide. And I wanted to show you a video clip because I found, and people came up to me after the last webinar and said what I found most interesting was what's happening around the world. Because maybe where you live, you seem to be the only one who's working on this issue, but actually this is happening worldwide. So I'm just going to show you a bit of a clip from Italy.
Attenzione! 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 Noi vogliamo il principio di precauzione!
I guess they did a die-in. So these sorts of protests are happening in order to raise awareness in the community and among people about what is going on, because of many, this is an experiment on the public. The next one here is a clip from Australia where there was a protest. I guess there's a lot happening in Australia. In Israel, I also know that in Israel they're having conversations at the national level. This is at the Isle of Wight, which is an island in England. Protests happening there. We're talking about trees, which I talked about in our last webinar. There's so much research that has looked at impacts to trees and plants and found effects. In Cyprus, and the government of Cyprus actually has, as I talked about in the other webinar, and if you haven't gone online to our website where we have a whole section on Cyprus, please do, because the country has just a wealth of the Department of Children and the Environment has put out public information videos which are translated into English for teenagers, for pregnant women, for parents, about how to reduce exposure to wireless. And here's a protest in Cyprus where they actually have some test cities calling to halt 5G. Public health must be prioritized over phone companies, reads the headline from Cyprus Mail.
Σύμφωνα με τον Παγκόσμιο Οργανισμό Υγείας, η ακτινοβολία που εκπέμπεται από τα κινητά τηλέφωνα, τα Wi-Fi και άλλες ασύρματες συσκευές είναι πιθανώς καρκινογόνα για τον άνθρωπο.
Η τεχνολογία είναι μέρος της ζωής μου.
Γνωρίζω όμως καλά τους κινδύνους της ασύρματης επικοινωνίας. Και ξέρω πώς να προστατεύω τον εαυτό μου.
Η συνεχής και πολλαπλή έκθεση στην ακτινοβολία αυτή είναι πιθανό να έχει σοβαρές επιδράσεις στην ανάπτυξη και λειτουργία του εγκεφάλου, του αναπαραγωγικού συστήματος, να προκαλέσει καταστροφή των νευρικών κυττάρων και του DNA απόσπαση της προσοχής, διαταραχές στη μάθηση και άλλες νευρολογικές διαταραχές. Οι κίνδυνοι αυτοί είναι ακόμη μεγαλύτεροι για τους εφήβους, οι οποίοι βρίσκονται σε μια κρίσιμη φάση της ανάπτυξής τους.
Προτιμώ τη χρήση σταθερού τηλεφώνου όταν βρίσκομαι στο σπίτι.
Έχω απενεργοποιημένες τις προσβάσεις μου στο διαδίκτυο αν τηλεφωνώ, όταν παρακολουθώ βίντεο, όταν ακούω μουσική ή όταν παίζω παιχνίδια.
Χρησιμοποιώ ενσύρμα τη σύνδεση στον υπολογιστή μου για να έχω ασφαλή και γρήγορη πρόσβαση στο διαδίκτυο. Ενεργοποιώ τις ασύρματες συνδέσεις μόνο όταν είναι απόλυτη ανάγκη και τις κρατώ πάντα κλειστές κατά τη διάρκεια της νύχτας. Σβήνω πάντα το κινητό μου όταν πάω για ύπνο, το κρατάω έξω από το υπνοδωμάτιο.
Χρησιμοποιώ hands-free και κρατώ το κινητό και άλλες ηλεκτρονικές συσκευές μακριά από το σώμα μου.
Δεν τοποθετώ το κινητό τηλέφωνο στις τσέπες του παντελονιού ή κοντά στο στήθος.
Αποφεύγω την παθητική έκθεση, κρατώντας αποστάσεις από αυτούς που χρησιμοποιούν κινητό τηλέφωνο ή άλλες ασύρματες συσκευές.
Δεν χρησιμοποιώ το κινητό στο αυτοκίνητο, σε ανελκυστήρες ή σε άλλους χώρους με χαμηλή λήψη. Εκεί η έκθεση στην ακτινοβολία είναι πολύ μεγαλύτερη. Η ζωή και το μέλλον είναι στα δικά μας χέρια.
Ζούμε με την τεχνολογία, αλλά προσέχουμε να μεγαλώνουμε με υγεία. Δώστε στους εφήβους ένα μοναδικό δώρο ζωής, την υγεία τους.
In addition to the EMF scientist appeal and the appeal to halt 5G by scientists to the United Nations and to the European Union, most recently there are over 344 doctors signed on to an appeal in Belgium, which recommends, just as scientists and medical professionals are, reducing exposure to children in schools, that we need to reduce, not increase exposure. And then in Cyprus, the Cyprus Medical Association and the Cyprus Committee on Environment and Children's Health has issued a position statement submitted to the Parliament on 5G, asking for protections. And the implementation of 5G protection zones. Whereas in the United States, the FCC is rolling out 5G by streamlining procedures and issuing rules and regulations that are stripping our local authority. And as I talked about, the EPA was defunded from setting proper safety limits and is actually not involved at all. We have no health and safety agency at all in the United States that is overseeing or has authority to look at the health implications from the networks, from the cell antennas, which are planning and already are being placed all over our country. And the EPA, and to the left is a letter that was written in 2002, where it is clearly stated we don't have limits that address long-term non-thermal, low-level exposures. And this is sort of the recent, really important news that has happened. So there was just a publication, peer-reviewed, published analysis of data from the United States government, large $30 million study on cell phone radiation, which found DNA damage. They showed significant increases of DNA damage in the frontal cortex of male mice, the leukocytes of female mice, and the hippocampus of male rats. Now, in this study, this was a $30 million study where rats and mice were exposed for 2 years to radiofrequency radiation. And these results on the cancer and actually the data on DNA has been released over the last few years. In 2018, the final reports came out, highlighting clear evidence of cancer found in the male rats. However, there were a lot of other effects that were found as well, and these is the information about the DNA damage. Actually, these animals, the data on DNA damage is from animals sacrificed between 10 and 14 weeks. So they had exposure groups that they were looking at for the whole 2 years, but they took in each of these groups a subset of them that they sacrificed early to look for DNA damage. And DNA damage was found statistically significant. So this has just been published. It's extremely important because you'll often hear that non-ionizing radiation cannot lead to DNA damage because it's non-ionizing. There's no direct impact at the atomic level. But this shows quite the opposite. Now, how does this happen is actually addressed in the paper, looking at mechanisms. It can be that there is an increase in oxidative stress or impact to the repair mechanism, because we're always exposed to toxins in our environment, and our DNA is constantly being damaged, and we're constantly repairing our DNA in our bodies all the time. So could it be that there is an impact to the DNA repair process? Could it be the oxidative stress, which then leads to these? That has all been discussed in the paper. But regardless, there is an association, just as there was over 20 years ago now by Dr. Henry Lai and researchers Singh as well. And at that time, so over 20 years ago, when DNA damage was found from radiofrequency, the results were huge. And there was a memo between Motorola and their PR firm talking about wargaming the science, wargaming this research that showed a DNA break. Again, this was 20 years ago. And that strategy, wargaming, is what remains still the strategy today, it seems, in terms of creating doubt when it comes to this issue. DNA damage was found then, an association between exposure and impacts to the DNA, and here we have it again in really the most well-controlled study of its kind in the United States. And just to back up, I talk about this study a lot, and sometimes people are very familiar with it. However, there are a lot of folks who are saying, wait, tell me more about this study. So I wanted to share a news report when the findings of these studies first came out showing cancer, because this study was launched by the United States, funded by the United States, because we didn't have data on what the long-term impact would be from cell phones. This was way back when we were just talking about cell phones. Now with 5G, we're talking about cell phones, self-driving cars, all manner of wirelessly connected devices and networks. So when it was first, actually the FDA asked for it to be initiated. They said we need animal studies to understand what the long-term impact will be. That was way back in 1999. And the results were first released, some results in 2016, then in 2018, and now in 2019 we have the publication of the DNA data. But I want to just share with you a clip of a news report back in 2018.
Cell phones really cause cancer? It's been a question that's dodged researchers for years. Now, but a group of experts are now saying the results of some tests are pretty surprising. Here is consumer editor Susan Copen.
Millions, maybe billions of us constantly call, text, click, take pictures, and play on our cell phones. Even the top cellular radiation researchers from around the world have a hard time untethering. But they gathered recently in North Carolina to talk about cell phone concerns and whether they really do increase our chances of developing cancer. The panel voted that the results from years of testing on mice and rats were more significant than originally thought. They say they found clear evidence that phone radiation caused tumors in the hearts of rats, similar to tumors in people.
In humans, it's seen in the vestibular nerve in the ear, the acoustic nerve. We found it in the heart, although our animals were exposed in their whole body condition.
While a given animal is not making a cell phone call, they are, throughout their short 2-year lifetime, getting the same exposure that we would expect people to get in their 70-plus years of life.
Activists are now calling for more protections, citing separate studies from France and Italy.
Many brain tumor lawsuits going on right now that are waiting for a study like this to prove that people's brain cell phone radiation.
And there are new concerns on the horizon. 5G is about to debut a stronger system of broadband. Some activists say the government has a responsibility to increase regulations.
And I think it's also a responsibility of the ones making up the phones to make them as safe as possible. And I'm sure they can do better than what we actually have.
Susan Copen, KDKA TV News.
So that video clip was from when the peer review of this $30 million study happened in North Carolina at the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. And you saw in the video Dr. Annie Sasko, as well as Dr. Deborah Davis. And what I'm going to show you now is a clip that I actually took. I was there as well. Also, Dr. Marco Razzi of the PhoneGate Association, and I'm going to be doing an entire webinar dedicated to PhoneGate and cell phone testing. But what I'm going to show you now is Dr. Ronald Melnick. He's one of our scientific advisors, a 28-year National Institute of Health scientist. He led the design of this study. He's now retired, but he presented, as well as several other experts. All of this is online on our YouTube channel. The reason I want to share this with you is because what he is talking about is how important this study is. The study ensured that the levels were at non-thermal levels, levels that didn't cause the amount of heating that is assumed to be harmful. So there is a level at which ICNIRP would say, and the FCC, at this heating level, it is harmful. And all of the levels of the exposures in the animals were carefully controlled in underground bunkers, which were actually brought over from Switzerland. There are these chambers underground where the animals were housed to make sure that they wouldn't have that high of a level. And yet effects were found. The study was to test the assumption that FCC limits are based on that only heating can cause harm. And he is going to talk about how that has been disproven.
Because people were saying this is non-ionizing radiation, there's no possibility for an adverse biological effect, and therefore the study was designed to challenge that hypothesis. That's why it was as many hours per day, because we knew there was a limitation on how high of an exposure intensity you could go without causing a heating effect. In chemical studies, you can go higher than what is an occupational exposure limit. But here, the limit is on heating. So you want to challenge the null hypothesis to the extent possible. Then, if you see an effect, what is the dose-response relationship? Because that kind of information can then be used for a quantitative risk assessment. And that's what would lead to FCC perhaps making some kind of decision. In terms of what this means then for 5G, is that the assumption still exists. There's no reason to believe that there is an effect. That's why this study is so important. It says the null hypothesis has been disproven. Therefore, if we're going to roll out new technologies, shouldn't we know whether there are health effects before exposing the general population?
And you can actually watch, this is part of a conversation that happened in the peer review. It was a 3-day peer review. Dr. Melnick's comments are all online on YouTube. You can watch that. You can also read the extensive research which he has both published and written regarding ICNIR, regarding the National Toxicology Program, and the call he and many scientists are calling on the US government for a quantitative risk assessment. And what that means is that they would take the data from this study and understand then what does that mean in terms of impacts to humans, in terms of how many per million, billion, et cetera. And this has not been done. The FDA is rejecting the findings of the NTP study and saying that limits do not need to be changed at this point. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And here is actually another clip of Dr. Melnick talking at a 5G symposium we had in Michigan. I'm sorry about that. I have like a lot of phones in the house, and that's just gonna ring. So talking about the study, and you can watch his video where he talks about the study, what the findings were, and also his conclusions, especially in regards to 5G and children.
Because of the widespread use of cell phones, even a small increase in risk would have a serious public health impact. And in the meantime, rather than telling people, if you are concerned, this is what you can do, the health agencies need to promote precautionary measures, especially for children and women, because in children, the risks could be greater due to the increased penetration, as well as the sensitivity of the developing brain to tissue damaging agents. So finally, what is the lesson learned? We should no longer assume that any current or future wireless technology, including 5G, is safe without adequate testing, because to not do so is not ethical.
And here is the study again on PubMed. You can also go onto our website to learn about it. Dr. Joel Moskowitz has put out a post about it on Safer EMR, and that has been published. And as it says, these results suggest that exposure to radiofrequency radiation is associated with an increase in DNA damage. So what I have here is the U.S. National Toxicology Program has a webpage where they have the results of their study, and as you can see, it says clear evidence of cancer in the male rats, some evidence of tumors in the brains of male rats, the increased gliomas. And if you scroll down on the page, I don't have all of it here, I have to the side, let's see if you can see my cursor. If you scroll down on this page on the National Toxicology Program website, you'll see where they talk about launching new studies regarding to better understand both the DNA damage and also how these findings occurred. They say the National Toxicology Program is currently evaluating the existing literature on the higher frequencies intended for use in the 5G network and is working to better understand the biological basis for cancer findings reported in these studies using 2G and 3G technology. Additionally, work is ongoing to develop exposure chambers with radiofrequency for additional short-term studies that will take weeks and months rather than years. And that is happening now, so you can go on the website. They are doing this research. I have also, if you can see, a clip from Microwave News, which is an incredible resource. Please go to microwavenews.com. Also, their newsletter is excellent. Absolutely, if you're working on this issue, it's critical to be aware of Microwave News and to follow their reporting on the issue, because they just did a post about this recent publication on DNA damage. And there have apparently been chambers, the chambers to house the animals, that has been delivered to NIEHS in North Carolina. So it sounds like they are moving forward on studying how this has happened and the mechanism. And the question remains for all of us, do we want to be part of the experiment? Because while there is research ongoing at NIH, and they are also rolling this out now in our communities. So research is ongoing, microwave news. Now, someone pointed this out when I did a presentation, actually at a teacher union, National Federation of Teachers. Someone went on their phone and they said, hey, you're telling me that NIH did the study, but I am on the NIH website, the National Cancer Institute, and it doesn't say anything about what you're talking about. So I sort of wanted to put this side by side for you to see. On the one side is what the NTP says. This is actually what a lot of our federal agency says. And if you look here, what the NCI says, if you go to the National Cancer Institute page on cell phones and cancer risk, it is a huge, long page with a lot of information. So I was on it and I said, well, let me search. Let me find out what they talk about related to the NTP study. And they say, the primary outcomes observed were a small number of cancers of Schwann cells in the heart and non-cancerous changes in the same tissues from male rats, but not female rats nor in mice overall. That's where they put the findings, which is very different from what we see on the NTP page. So we have two federal agencies, different information, and frankly, a member of the general public would be completely lost on the NCI page. People new to this who go to that page say, it says that cell phones are safe, and that is absolutely not what it says. It goes into different studies, some of which are industry funded in terms of the cohort studies. But and here's our situation with our federal agencies. The FDA disagrees with the NTP. The EPA website was just completely changed last year. A lot of information deleted, new information put up. All of it sends us right to the FCC. The CDC has nothing on the National Toxicology Program findings. It says research is investigating acoustic aromas, but doesn't even put the findings up. So that is the situation in the United States, where you can't, even if you wanted to get information, you would be hard-pressed to find it unless you even know where to look. So, oh, I apologize. I didn't mean to have this here, but I will put it here. So I talked about in last week's webinar on 5G how 5G is going to utilize the frequencies we have now that are being used for 2, 3, and 4G. In fact, as they are going to be taking frequencies that say are used for 3G now and then repurposing them for 5G. So 3G is being turned off in a lot of countries, and they will be then using those frequencies for 5G. It's different depending on what country. But they also, 5G is also going to be using millimeter waves, frequencies that are much higher in energy, and were first researched, actually not first, but they've been researched for decades, especially in Russia and in the United States. But they are used in military weaponry at very high power. So at very high power, they can be used to create a sensation where the skin is on fire. Sometimes you'll hear, well, it's not even penetrating too deeply, just a little bit into the skin. But it is penetrating into the skin to a certain depth, and that does not mean that it's safe. And I just want to show you how the military developed this weapon. So then I'm going to talk about more the use in 5G.
Energy is sent downrange at the speed of light. The electromagnetic...
Oh, I should mention, this is a video on the active denial defense system, which was developed several years ago, brought to Afghanistan, I believe tested in prisons, This is from the History Channel describing how this works.
Magnetic radiation released by the active denial is sent downrange at the speed of light. The electromagnetic radiation released by the active denial system is similar to the microwaves in your microwave oven, in that it causes the water molecules in the target to become excited and heat up. But that's where the similarity ends. The ADS is designed to heat only the very surface of the skin. It does this by outputting only the carefully chosen radio wave frequency of 95 gigahertz. Even though it can easily penetrate clothing, the ADS generates a much shorter and safer wavelength of radio waves than those used in microwave ovens.
The active denial system millimeter wave directed energy beam reaches 1/64th of an inch into human skin. So that is the outermost layer of the skin, roughly equivalent to about 3 sheets of notebook paper. It is essentially affecting the pain nerves in the outermost layer of the skin, heating them up and causing an immediate repel effect.
Okay, so we already know that the US government has put aside for 7G terahertz waves. So although 95 is not being used right now in 5G systems, they are using higher frequencies that are inching towards what is used in that weapon. And many scientists are raising concerns about this for several reasons. Before I introduce the work of physicists from Israel that have looked into how it penetrates into the skin, I want to mention that our skin is our largest organ, and a lot of our immune system is connected with our skin. There's a lot of chemical changes that happen. You think about, you can think about so many examples of where you can put something on the skin and you can have a systemic response in your entire body because of reactions that happen on the skin, and there are biochemical changes. As well, scientists are raising concerns about, of course, skin cancer. And what will it mean if we're exposed to these higher frequencies, which intensely are absorbed into the skin uniquely over years and years. I mean, we don't have data on human exposure to these frequencies, chronic exposure, and that is one of the concerns. Actually, concerns is an inadequate word for the way that this is being characterized by scientists who are opposed to the rollout. So I wanted to introduce, this is from a forum at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies at Hebrew University. I believe there were 13 scientists from over 13 countries present. This was an international forum. You can go online to the EHT website and watch videos from this conference where Paul Ben-Ishai presented his research showing how what they did is they modeled and actually subsequently this has all been published, I'm going to talk about that, how do the millimeter waves, how are they absorbed into the skin? Specifically into structures within the skin, looking at close up in terms of the sweat gland. And I'll just play you a clip of his presentation, which you can watch online.
Energy is sent downrange. Energy is...
So they commissioned him to find out why, and he had an amazing discovery when he looked at the SAR rates, and he found that preferentially the SAR rate was going very high inside the sweat duct as compared to the surrounding tissue. So there's already some evidence that there's a physical influence could be on us from him, especially 5G. What worries me is that is basically an industry panel, and it is not independent. And as you can see, they are making quite good progress. And within 2 years, you said, guys? 2 years, we should have this everywhere, all over us. And this has not been looked at. Nobody's really considering what health effects could be because of that mechanism, which we've proven to exist. It is there Nobody's really considering what it can be.
So what he was talking about was the effect of the way that the sweat gland in the skin is uniquely absorbing these higher frequencies, different than the surrounding structures, in a way which, let me quote exactly what he says. So there are two studies that their team has published. One is the human skin is a sub-terahertz receiver. Does 5G pose a danger to it or not? And then also another study, the modeling of the absorbance of sub-terahertz radiation by human skin. And I'll just quote the study. The results of our study emphasize that rather than gallop towards these solutions with abandon, the human health implications must be considered first, as wavelengths approach the dimensions of skin-based features. Because as the wavelengths are the same size as the sweat gland, it is absorbing a rate much higher than the other structures, which can have all kinds of implications into our skin, especially you think about long-term exposure. And they state, we are raising a warning flag against the unrestricted use of sub-terahertz technologies for communication before the possible consequences for public health are explored. And all of that research and more is on our website, where we have a list of all the studies related to 5G, because you will often hear there is no evidence, but there is evidence. By elected officials say there is no evidence, or industry says there is no evidence of harm. There is extensive published research on a variety of endpoints showing adverse effects. Not just one study, not just two, but many. And again, the 5G appeal, which I talked about in a last webinar, where I think now over 200, more than 240 scientists have signed on calling to halt 5G. You can go to that at 5gappeal.edu. So what I wanted to share right now, because this comes up a lot, is people say, well, the consensus is that this is safe, but yet you have these hundreds of scientists calling for harm. What is going on? And this is Dr. Van de Venter, who is of the World Health Organization EMF project. And she was asked this question. I think this is from a Swedish presentation back in 2016. And she was asked, what about these hundreds of scientists who are calling for action on wireless radiation, the EMF scientist appeal? And here is her response, which I think speaks volumes, because she is an engineer, had her roots in working for industry, with industry funds at a university, and heads the World Health Organization EMF project. And I just want to play a clip of her being asked by a Swedish journalist on this issue.
Mona Nilsson, Swedish Radiation Protection Foundation. Last year, 220 scientists, there are now 220 scientists signed an appeal that was sent to you and to the United Nations and its member nations, saying that the evidence is enough to take precautions and that the guidelines are far too high. They say we have evidence of DNA damage, oxidative stress, and neurological impact and damage, for instance, and reproductive problems. I also have a list here with over 500 studies that, if we have to trust the Swedish authority here and the World Health Organization, are all wrong. They show a consistent pattern that this radiation is harmful. What is your reply to those 220 scientists? And I also want another question. The second question is, why should the public in Sweden and the world trust you more than those 220 scientists?
Thank you. Well, it's not a personal question. Of course, it's 220 versus, I don't know, what is your reference?
So I'd like to just play that little response, because this is the response.
Of course, it's 220 versus, I don't know, what is your reference? But I have to say that...
So then she goes on to talk about studies that were sent to her that were not a part of the beginning review process that the WHO EMF process started. But that response, I believe, speaks volumes, because there truly are a small handful of scientists who are in a lot of what are considered the authorities around the world, who are all saying the same thing, that the levels we have, the limits we have are safe, only heating will harm us, despite the fact, as the study that was just published on DNA damage just shows, that there are impacts at much lower levels. And this is just a clip from Investigate Europe's report. They have a really important report online, 5G, the mass experiment, and also how much is safe, where they talk about a group of they actually looked into how there are really, I'll just read, a group of 14 scientists who either help create or defend the current guidelines disseminated by ICNIRP, and that they are self-selected, and that they argue that all of the studies which have found harm at lower levels are insufficient to change guidelines. They also have issued now, I believe, statements and reports, which are not peer-reviewed, by the way, or published, as the NTP findings on DNA damage were, that the NTP studies discounting, they have all kinds of criticisms of the way the study was done, and they say that it does not result in a change in their thinking. And important to note, ICNIRP is a invite-only club, and scientists who, many of these independent scientists in the EMF scientist appeal or the 5G moratorium appeal to the EU, they are not represented in ICNIRP. So there are a couple, I mentioned these in the last webinar, I did want to mention them. The European Commission has two reports which are really important. One was on emerging health and environmental risks, and they classify the impact of 5G as high. And if you go to section 4.4, on the potential effects of wildlife of increases in electromagnetic radiation, they cite research studies, several studies, which we also have online. They say the lack of clear evidence to inform the development of exposure guidelines to 5G technology leaves open the possibility of unintended biological consequences. And I talked in the last webinar about some of that research on impacts to trees and bees. This is very important and has not been adequately scientifically addressed by in the rollout, because there has been no environmental review to look at what the impact will be. And it seems first there should be an environmental review before rolling it out. It also mentioned the report in 2019, 5G deployment, state of play in Europe and USA and Asia. And what I want to talk about that's very important that they raise is the challenge in accurately measuring 5G emissions in real world situations. There's a lot of industry conversations, presentations, but what the actual levels will be in communities when 5G deployment is fully on, we don't have adequate way to measure that. The community members don't have tools to measure it, and even industry themselves don't have a way to adequately measure what the levels will be between the beamforming and the multiple antennas with multiple frequencies and actually different modulations that will all be in use at the same time. So this report reads, increased exposure may result not only from the use of much higher frequencies in 5G, but also in the potential for the aggregation of different signals, because there'll be multiple antennas with, at the same time transmitting, their dynamic nature, the complex interference effects that may result, especially in dense urban areas. And they talk about the highly focused beams that will be used. They vary rapidly with time and movement, and so are unpredictable, as the signal levels and patterns interact as a closed-loop system. This has yet to be mapped reliably for real situations outside the laboratory. The problem is that currently it is not possible to accurately simulate or measure 5G emissions in the real world. I'm reading that again because it seems like if you're going to roll out a technology, you should be able to measure what the exposures will be. And I am going to dedicate a whole webinar to PhoneGate, but I just wanted to point out that at the EU Parliament, there was a press conference involving Professor Martin Pall, Dr. Marco Razzi, and Maurizio Martucci of the Italian Stop 5G Alliance as well. And that is online. More information about that at PhoneGate. And I'm going to touch on this because I just think it's so important. We have an entire section of our webpage dedicated to what is happening around the world in terms of countries, laws, and regulations to reduce radiation exposure, wireless, and cell phone. Everything from bans in nursery schools and kindergartens in several countries to a ban on the sale of phones designed for children in Belgium and France. And also a lot of countries, not the United States, are ensuring that, well, they have systems whereby they are measuring certain areas to know what are the radiation levels in communities. And if you want to know what the level is in your area, you can request measurements in some municipalities. I know in France that they're doing that by law. So there's a lot going on, whereas in the United States, we're rolling it out more. So, as an example, in French Polynesia, I just thought this was fascinating, wanted to share, where they have a public health education campaign on electromagnetic radiation. And this is just a quick clip from one of the videos that they're sharing to educate the public about how they are exposed to electromagnetic radiation. And you can see they show the cell tower, they show devices in the home, both, and they talk not only about wireless radiation, but also about extremely low frequency fields, which are from the power line, electromagnetic radiation from appliances, from devices in your homes as well. So in the United States, there are several laws which have been passed statewide. Oregon passed a bill so that the health authority is going to review research on the health effects of wireless with a focus on schools. New Hampshire and Louisiana are studying the health effects of 5G. There's actually a commission that has been formed in New Hampshire, and as I understand it, is in process of meeting, and they are going to be having expert testimony, and they are looking at the health effects of 5G, and I believe we'll be coming up with a report. There are public health recommendations to reduce exposure. American Academy of Pediatrics recommends reducing cell phone radiation exposure to children. The California and Connecticut Department of Health have issued guidance on how to reduce exposure to your cell phones. There have been proclamations in Portland, Hallandale Beach, Florida, Greendale, Wisconsin, about 5G. Proclamations also on cell phone radiation, Pembroke Pines, Florida, Jackson Hole, Wyoming. If you haven't watched Jimmy Gonzalez, who was the lawyer who prompted the Pembroke Pines City Council to issue those recommendations, please go online and watch Jimmy Gonzalez talk about the cell phone radiation. And a lot going on related to schools, of which I'm going to do an entire webinar on, recommendations to reduce exposure, and schools which are reducing exposure. So in terms of 5G and the small cell rollout, and this is from SB 649, which was a bill to streamline small cell build out in California. And you're seeing, it was many elected officials from local communities and people in opposition to this bill, which ultimately, although it passed, it was not signed by the governor because it would take away local authority to decide what is on their rights of way in their streets. And the reason I'm sharing this is because some really important information came out. Both, you can watch the testimony online as well, and there were letters from organizations all across the state, from medical doctors, of which you can access on our website on ehtrust.org, letters from doctors, from scientists, various organizations. The firefighters lobbied very hard to not be forced to have antennas on their stations. They were carved out of the bill. They have been raising issues about health impacts for quite some time. I know that here on the East Coast, we have firefighter stations that have antennas mounted on our fire stations in our communities. But in California and certain localities, they have asked that they not be forced to have those on. And I'm going to share a quick clip. And I actually put a little video of cigarette company ads at the beginning and end because I think it's just so pertinent, but of some news footage during that time when the streamlining bill in California was to be passed, just to give you a sense of what went on there.
They're particular about the brand they choose. In a repeated national survey, doctors in all branches of medicine, doctors in all parts of the country were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?" Once again, the brand named most was Camel.
5G can be a tremendous boom to California, but only if it can be put up quickly and easily.
Hayward Assemblymember Bill Quart co-authored legislation that would make it even harder for cities like Piedmont to object to a tower.
You wouldn't have to go through the Planning Commission, through the City Council.
The former NASA scientist says he may resurrect the bill recently vetoed by the governor.
I know scientifically that putting up these cell phone towers is safe.
But the International Association of Firefighters disagrees. They began opposing cell towers on fire stations after firefighters complained of health problems.
These firefighters developed symptoms.
Dr. Gunnar Heuser conducted a pilot study on firefighters at a station with cell towers.
And the symptoms included problem with memory, problem with intermittent confusion, problem with weakness.
Heuser says their brain scans suggest even low-level RF can cause cell damage, and he worries about more vulnerable groups like kids.
So we found abnormal brain function in all of the firefighters we examined.
So, following lobbying by firefighters, Quart and his co-author exempted fire stations from their bill, making them one place cell companies couldn't put a tower. This is the first piece of legislation that I think anyone's aware of where somebody got an exemption because they were concerned about health. Did they tell you at all about the study?
All I know is that when the firefighters ask, I do what they ask me to do.
Because they're strong lobbyists.
Yes.
So if, say, school teachers and parents had a strong lobby and they asked you to pass something that would prevent these from going up in your schools, would you do that?
If I couldn't get the votes any other way.
Firefighter and cancer survivor Tony Stefani notes,
It's not only firefighters, it's the people that live in the general vicinity of these towers.
current regulations don't take into account continuous low-level exposure from these small cells 24 hours a day.
More of these studies have to be done.
There are 230 scientists from 41 countries who have apparently reviewed more than 2,000 peer-reviewed studies, and they're calling on the World Health Organization to do more studies. They're not convinced that this is safe.
I think doing more studies is always a good thing.
Do you think that maybe you should consider putting a pause on legislation that speeds up these towers until there's definitive evidence that there is no harm?
We could do a lot of studies, and there are people right now believe it or not, who are sure the world is flat.
Smoke clean with Newberry. Air clean tobacco.
Okay, that's a longer news clip, which is all online. And I just had to put that point about the flat earth. For some reason, this is coming up. There's comparing people who are opposed to 5G to the flat earth movement, which is absolutely, makes no sense. But that is part of the creation of doubt. I guess that is a strategy that is being used right now. And I think it's quite the opposite. So I talked about what other cities are doing, especially Los Altos. And you can go online and see some of the more protected ordinances that cities are passing in order to retain their authority. They do not want to be forced to put small cells up in communities without having a say, and communities want to have a say. And that's all going on. It's like as it happens right now. I know in San Francisco, there was an ordinance passed which would streamline, and I need to find out what has just happened there on this issue as well, because I know that this happens everywhere where you find out about it after something's been passed already. And oh, there's a small cell going up in my front yard. What's going on? People are absolutely in shock to learn that they don't have a say in the matter in many communities. So going on to, I'm going to focus a little bit on the United States right now. The FCC has been passing rules and regulations to streamline the build out of small cells and 4G, 5G antennas. They're estimating, I think, 800,000 sites are needed. Of course, you can have many antennas per site, and that's just in the United States alone, and just in the next few years, according to the FCC. So as this happened, in 2018, when some of these orders were passed, there were two lawsuits I'm going to talk about. One was an appeal brought by the Natural NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and Native American tribes, as well as Attorney Ed Myers, one of our advisors, stating that they could not eliminate environmental and historic preservation review for wireless installations, because the FCC was doing away with the requirement, according to NEPA, to have an environmental review if that was what was called for. And actually, that was a win. So in August of this year, the U.S. Court of Appeals ruled that, in fact, the small cell installations cannot bypass impact reviews related to environment and historic preservation. And they have vacated that aspect of the regulations which were passed. So if there needs to be an environmental review, there needs to be one. They cannot bypass it. There's also another lawsuit of which there are nearly 100 cities, towns, counties, and associations who are suing the FCC, arguing that the FCC lacks statutory authority to be forcing their communities to streamline small cells in a variety of ways that the FCC is stating, related to money, relating to shot clocks and more. Now that case is ongoing, and as I understand it, it's been transferred from the 10th Circuit to the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. There's also a bill introduced by Representative Eshoo from California, which would bring back authority to the local communities. And I talked about how the case was won in terms of historic and environmental review. And now I want to show just a little background on, in the United States, we have no proof of safety related to 5G. And there's been a whole conversation happening actually between Congress, the FDA, and the FCC. And I'm going to show to give you a little background. So in 2018, a mayor asked about proof of safety related to 5G and was told that there was safety. So then Senator Blumenthal wrote and asked, well, show us where this proof of safety is. And I have clips from 2018 from Senator Blumenthal talking about how he then requested this proof of safety. And then at a Senate Commerce hearing, when he received answers from the FDA and FCC, he talks about how what he received was inadequate and not proof of safety and superficial information. So I'm just going to play some clips from this to see the conversation happening in the United States right now. And actually, there's several members of Congress who are now writing the FCC and the FDA asking more questions about 5G safety.
We also need to have very clear direction, talking points, studies that have been done that show that there is no harm to our constituents and to the taxpayers on putting these small cells on towers close to libraries, close to schools, close to their homes. So the FCC, as well as other agencies that are experts in health and safety issues, are always looking very closely at these issues, staying up to date on the latest science. They've looked at all of the studies and all the information, and they've reached the determination that these are safe.
Okay, we don't have any documentation that there has been a systematic review on this issue, especially on the antennas. In fact, there's no agency in the United States, no health or safety agency, whose job it is to do what he is saying, because the FDA only has the purview of dealing with the cell phones, not the antenna systems or the ambient levels. So, but this is what was stated in 2018.
And that's a determination that is constantly undergoing review, and any new information that comes up is taken into account. And in fact, given the position of the federal agencies on this, federal law actually says that state and local governments can't take RF concerns into account, given how much work has already gone into this issue at the federal level.
So in December of 2018, I sent a letter to FCC Commissioner Carr asking him to cite for me recent scientific studies demonstrating the safety of this technology. What research has been done, where has it been published and compiled. He has essentially failed to do so, and just echoed the general statements of the FDA, which shares regulatory responsibility for cell phones with the FCC. If you go to the FDA website, pretty unsatisfactory. There basically is a cursory and superficial citation to existing scientific data. I believe that Americans deserve to know what the health effects are, not to prejudge what scientific studies may show, and they deserve also a commitment to do the research on outstanding questions. So my question for you, particularly Mr. Gillen and Mr. Berry, how much money has the industry committed to supporting additional independent research? I stress independent research. Is that independent research ongoing? Has any been completed? Where can consumers look for it? And we're talking about research on the biological effects of this new technology.
Thank you, Senator. I think, thank you for your focus on the issue. Safety is paramount, and as you alluded to, we rely on the expert agencies, we rely on the findings of the FDA and others as to the requirements to keep all of us safe. There are no industry-backed studies, to my knowledge right now. Happy to visit with you as to what opportunities you think there needs to be more studies, and we're always for more science. We also rely on what the scientists tell us.
So essentially, the answer to my question, how much money? Zero.
I can certainly follow up with you, Senator. To my knowledge, there's no active studies being backed by industry today.
But no, I'm not aware of any. So there really is no research ongoing. We're kind of flying blind here, so far as health and safety is concerned. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We also need to.
Okay, so now there have been several members of Congress and also in state elected officials that have written the FCC, the FDA, and asking for the proof of safety related to 5G. And we have all of that online on our website, as well as a response from the FCC, which is also on the FCC website as well as ours. So some people wrote in about this webinar that they wanted to talk about how to reduce exposure at home and what they can do to protect themselves. So I'm going to briefly talk about that. However, I'm going to be doing a webinar fully dedicated to reducing exposure at home. What are EMFs, like a basic 101 and how to reduce exposure, but I want to briefly describe a few things that you can do. First is to get a home and office corded landline like this, which I have, with a cord that is not wireless, not a cordless home phone. You can forward your cell phone to this line, like right when you go home. If you can't get a copper line, because in many communities we're not able to get them, even though taxpayers in the United States paid a lot of money for companies to maintain copper lines, the reality is they're very hard to get now. You can get a voice over IP. I am not able to get a copper line anymore. So this is through the internet service. It's the only choice I have. But there are a lot of options to have a corded home landline. So for the majority of your voice calls, use a landline phone, corded. I also have, I'm just sharing this with you because on one side is, when we have all of this on our site, how to reduce exposure to your cell phone. You know, keep the cell phone away from your head. Don't hold it to your head, use a speakerphone. Limit your overall time. If you still have a cell phone, it's still it's still increasing radiation to everyone around, and we don't have a safe level identified at this time. So corded, wired technology is what we know to be safe. Don't hold the phone up against your body. Don't make calls in cars, elevators, trains, and buses, because the phone works harder and emits more radiation to get a signal through metal. As well, when you have a moving vehicle, there's going to be, the phone is going to be connecting to new cell towers and peaking at different points as it does so. Also, on the other side, we have a flyer which you can download. We have it both a large poster as well as a smaller black and white, as well as color, regular sheet of paper on 5G. And then on the back, you can put information about your local group or anything going on in your community, but talks about issues with 5G, of which I've only really covered a few of them in this webinar and the last one. I'm going to be talking more about the e-waste issue, the weather issue, as well as some of the science and property devaluation. So these are useful resources. At home, get an Ethernet plug for your computer. I'm doing this webinar right now using a corded Ethernet for my computer, not Wi-Fi, and I don't have a wireless router or modem, any wireless antennas actually in my home. I have an adapter because my computer, you can't plug the Ethernet in, so I had to get a special adapter to plug in. And I also have the Wi-Fi turned off of all of the devices. So on this computer, I have up in settings, the Wi-Fi antennas are off. Now, I really recommend that you get a meter to measure what the levels are in your home, especially from your devices, because there's some computers and some phones where you think you've turned the antennas off and you haven't turned them off, or even routers as well. So really important to be measuring and knowing what you're dealing with. I had bought a Mac, actually. I could not get all the antennas off, especially with Siri. Whenever Siri was pressed, there was some button on the front. It just turned on some antenna, even though the wireless was off. And some iPhones can be Ethernet connected for data connections. So I will be talking more about that. We also have a whole section online to learn more about this. In your bedroom especially, and this is often where people start, is in the bedroom. Remove all the screens. Make sure there's no wireless or cordless phones, and even your electronics. Turn the wireless off at night if you haven't figured out how to hardwire your router and your internet connections. Turn it off at night, and certainly when not in use, as a first step, as you get everything you need so that you can turn it completely to hardwired connections, which are cabled, corded connections rather than wireless. Use a battery-powered alarm clock. You don't want to sleep with your phone right by your bed. Also consider blue light reducing eyewear and coverings for screens, which I have on my computer as well. If you have a smart meter, I hope that you can opt out to have an analog meter. If not, make sure that, and even if you have an analog, I should say, be sure that you're not sleeping near utility meters. They also have extremely low frequency fields that come off of them, and also electrical panels. And no electronics or electrical cords near or under the bed. You can also have breakers off to reduce the electrical fields and address the electromagnetic interference or dirty electricity, which is what I'll talk about in the next webinar when I talk about EMF in the home. And also try to have complete darkness when you sleep. We have coverings on the curtains that are complete blackout coverings, and as well an eye mask that completely covers, not even lets one little bit of light in, that really can help with melatonin. You're not having that light which is triggering your brain to think that it's daytime. Right now my bedroom is actually right near a street light, which I'm concerned about becoming a 5G cell tower, but also it emits light all night, so we have eye coverings as well as curtains. Please be sure to sign up for our newsletter, which is once a month or sometimes more, where we have the latest news on 5G and cell phones. Really important, and then we can be in touch with you and let you know what's going on. It's at our website, ehtrust.org.
Did you know that cell phone, the one in your pocket, emits radio frequency radiation? As long as your phone's turned on, even if you're not talking or texting.
The American Academy of Pediatrics, in over a dozen countries, recommends reducing children's exposure to wireless radiation.
When using a cell phone, I always keep it away from my body. I use speakerphone or a headset like this.
To stop microwave exposure, I put my phone on airplane mode and turn off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth function.
I hold the phone at a distance and make sure it's not touching my body.
Cell phones are not toys. Children's brains and bodies are still developing and are vulnerable to wireless radiation. Practice safe and responsible habits with yourself and your children.
When using the computer, I always try to make sure my connection is corded, not wireless.
Remember not to use your cell phone in the car. The phone works at higher power in metal surroundings and bounces around, increasing your family's radiation exposure.
For their safety.
For your safety.
Because children are more vulnerable.
Remind them.
Remind yourself.
To limit your microwave radiation exposures.